In this video, we're going to discuss international trade. International trade allows countries to consume goods and services that are beyond what they can produce themselves. In macroeconomics, we're interested in international trade because part of gross domestic product, GDP, is net exports, the amount of exports minus the amount of imports. International and global trade is extremely large. Roughly half of the production in the world is involved in international trade, some $42 trillion. In the United States, about 13% of the GDP is involved in exports, and 16% of GDP is involved in imports. And it's interesting to note that 1/3 of the US exports involves services. Now, what drives international trade? The fundamental force that drives international trade is comparative advantage. This is the same set of forces that drive trade in general. We say that when people within an economy specialize and they along comparative advantage and then they trade, that both parties are better off. Well, it's the same thing is true when nations specialize around comparative advantage and then trade. Both countries and the people within both countries are also better off. So comparative advantage is is the basis on which we decide which countries are going to produce what, and which countries are able to produce products at the lowest opportunity cost. So the important thing to remember here is that international trade is no different than trade in general. The force of the same forces govern international trade that govern trade within a country. And if countries were to organize their production around their relative comparative advantage, to specialize and then trade, then countries will be better off by trading. So we can look at an example, a simple example, and we'll go through this in some detail. We can look at a simple market with two goods, t-shirts and airplanes, and we can assume that the opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt in China is lower than it is in the United States. So therefore, China has a comparative advantage in producing t-shirts. Now, in a similar way, the opportunity cost of producing an airplane like a Boeing 787 is lower in the United States. So the U.S. has a comparative advantage in producing airplanes. Now, if both countries were to specialize and produce the things that they had a comparative advantage in, and then they traded, well, then both countries would be better off. Trade would be mutually beneficial to both countries. So let's look at that example in detail using some supply and demand graphs. So we see here the beginning situation with no trade in the United States. The market for t-shirts would generate about 40 million t-shirts being produced in the United States and sold in the United States at a price of $8. Now, if we consider international trade, well, the world price for t-shirts is much lower. It's only $5 instead of $8. And what that's basically saying is that the rest of the world has a comparative advantage in producing t-shirts. So when we open up the United States to international trade, then the manufacturers who make the shirts at $8 will have to compete with the manufacturers around the world who are able to sell the t-shirts at $5. And of course, $5 is lower than $8, and so that becomes the price that is used in the market. And so after we have international trade, the price of a t-shirt will fall from $8 to $5. The number of t-shirts produced goes from 40 million to 60 million t-shirts, because at the lower price, there's more. There's a greater demand for t-shirts in the United States. But of the 60 million t-shirts that are produced, 40 million are produced outside the United States and imported, and 20 million are produced inside the United States. So there's 20 million less shirts being produced in the United States, but the total number of shirts being produced is larger. It's 60 million t-shirts. Now we can look at the same situation with airplanes. So with no international trade, there are 400 airplanes produced within the United States, and they are sold at a price of $100 million each. And then if we um, look at a situation with international trade, well, the price in the world market for an airplane is much higher. It's $150 million, and this is indicative of the fact the United States has a comparative advantage in producing airplanes. So now the consumers within the United States, once you have international trade, well, they've got to compete with the consumers from the rest of the world. So if we have international trade, the price of the airplanes will go from 100 to 150 million, and the quantity at 150 million, well, the domestic producers will produce more airplanes, and they'll produce 700 planes instead of 400. Now, so we have 700 planes being produced in the United States at a price of $150 million. 500 of those planes are exported into the world market, and 200 of the planes are sold within the United States. So these people here are willing to pay the higher price, the 150 million for the planes, but it's certainly a smaller number going within the United States. There's a larger number being sold overall, but a smaller number being sold within the United States. So we can see that there are winners and losers in international trade, meaning some people benefit and some people do not benefit. International trade will lower the price of an imported good because domestic producers have to compete with all the producers around the world. But it raises the price of a good when you export it. So when you raise the price, um, because the consumers of the United States now have to compete with consumers from around the world. So buyers of imported goods benefit from lower prices. Sellers of exported goods benefit from higher prices. And so if we look at imports specifically, consumers gain from imports. They pay a lower price and they are able to buy more of a good. Domestic producers are harmed from having to compete with importers. Harmed in the sense that they receive a lower price for the things that they produce and they sell a smaller quantity. Conversely, when we look at exports, we can see that domestic consumers lose from exports. They pay higher prices and they are able to buy less of the exported goods. Domestic consumers now have to compete with all the consumers in the world, and some of them are willing to pay higher prices and therefore get some of the production. Domestic producers gain from exports. When they are able to export goods and services, they receive higher prices and can sell more of the goods that they're trying to export. So domestic producers gain from exports. If we look at the situation overall, we see that when you have trade, there are positive net gains. Sure, domestic producers of exported goods and domestic consumers gain and from exports and domestic producers of the imported goods and consumers of the exported goods. So there are some winners and losers, but on the whole, both parties are better off. When we add it all up, the gains exceed the losses, and this is um, one of the important things about trade. Both parties benefit by trade, even if within a specific country there are some people who benefit more than others. Overall, when we add it all up, the parties in both countries are better off. Now, we can now look and see um, there are sometimes when countries, governments will restrict trade. And they do this to protect domestic producers from competing. We call this protectionism. And any sort of trade restrictions that are done in order to minimize trade or protect producers or exporters is called protectionism. There's a couple of different types of protectionism or trade restrictions, and we'll go through each one and try to understand how they work. So the first one is a tariff. A tariff is a tax. It's a tax on a good that's imposed by an importing country when a good is imported into that country. So we can think of an example. Let's say the government of India imposed 100% tax or tariff on wine that was imported from the United States. They made a law that said if you bring wine from the United States, whatever the cost of the wine is, there is an additional tax equal to 100% of that value. So when an Indian wine merchant maybe imports a $10 bottle of wine from California, the merchant pays the government $10. They have to pay the wine manufacturers in California $10, and so the consumer has to pay $20, $10 to the for the wine and $10 for the tariff. I mean, they see just the price that's equal to both those added together, which is $20. Now, go back to our example and see how a tariff might work with free international trade. 40 million T-shirts were imported each year at $5 each. And in that marketplace, there were $60 million, 60 million T-shirts sold overall, but 20 of them were produced domestically, so they wouldn't be subject to the tariff. But now, let's say what happens if the United States puts a tariff of $2 on each imported T-shirt? Well, those 40 million T-shirts would have to pay that were imported would be subject to a $2 tariff. So now the price is no longer $5. The price is going to be $7. You have to add the $2, the $5 for the price of the T-shirt, and the $2 for the tariff. And so when that happens, the price is now $7, and a number of things happen. First of all, the demand at $7 is lower. It's only 45 million T-shirts. Second of all, the supply that's at $7 for domestic producers is higher. It's at $7 they can produce and sell 35 million T-shirts, and what's left is the imports went from 40 million to 10 million, so they dropped significantly. Now we can see that the total amount um, of shirts that are sold is 15 million less. The total amount of imports is 10 million less, and the total amount of domestically produced T-shirts is 15 million more. So there's a number of changes that happen here. That domestic producers produce more at higher prices. The imported um, T-shirts are subject to the higher prices. They wind up selling significantly less, so there's much less imported. And the government collects $20 million, $2 each on the 10 million T-shirts that are imported. And so you can see here what's happening with producers. Well, producers are getting a higher price, and domestic producers are getting a higher price and producing more. What happens with consumers? Domestic consumers are paying a higher price, and they're consuming less. So consumers are harmed by tariffs. They now have to pay $7 for the shirt that used to cost $5. And so this combination of higher prices and a smaller quantity makes the United States consumer worse off. Now, the effects of a tariff for producers are really the opposite. They benefit from tariffs. So domestic producers are now selling shirts at $7, $2 higher than they were able to before, and they sell a lot more T-shirts. They're now selling 35 million T-shirts when they were previously only able to sell a much smaller quantity, that only 20 million T-shirts. So they're better off. They get higher prices and they're able to sell more T-shirts. So domestic producers are better off. Now, if we look at all the pluses and minuses, what happens in the end? Well, the tariff results in a net loss. The consumers lose more from the tariffs than the producers gain. So although some parties are better off and some are worse off, overall, um, the, the 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 end result of a tariff is a net loss. We can see this from a numbers standpoint that um, that the consumers wind up losing $165 million in value. The producers gain $145 million in value, and so where the 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 net loss is $20 million. Now, it's true that $20 million will go to the government. Those are the taxes that the government will collect. But um, this is a loss to consumers and a gain to government. So to the extent that that the government uses that money to pay for services and goods and things that we all benefit from or like or approve of, well, that's at least a good thing. But uh, the uh, the fact is that we still have a social loss. The reason is because when the domestic producers are producing more t-shirts, we have to remember that they're producing it at a higher opportunity cost, a higher real cost. Their cost of production is higher, and also a higher opportunity cost. So this product that we got could have been gotten at a lower cost, and it's not. So we're purposely, through the use of tariffs, operating at a less efficient a scale. So this decreased quantity is in turn bought at a higher price, and it involves higher costs. So tariffs will benefit producers, domestic producers. It enables them to ship more goods and charge higher prices, but it hurts consumers, and the harm to consumers, the overall loss is greater to consumers than the gains are to producers. Now, we can see other types of trade restrictions in addition to tariffs. You can have a tariff is basically a tax, but you can also have a quota. An import quota is a restriction that the government creates that limits the amount of a good or a service that can be imported in a given time. So the United States might put a quota on the amount of sugar that can be imported, or bananas, or textile, or paper, or really anything. They can limit how much of a particular good or service is allowed to be imported at a particular time. This is another type of trade restriction. And so we can look at how a quota works. So this is our free trade situation with t-shirts. The t-shirts are $5. At $5, there are 60 million t-shirts consumed. 40 million are imported, and 20 million of the t-shirts are are made domestically. Now, when we add the quota, we basically, if the government says, well, you can't import any more than 10 million T-shirts, well, that limits uh, that limits uh, how many shirts can be brought in. Only 10 million. The difference between these two lines here is the 10 million, the two supply lines, and so we basically work off the original supply curve for domestic production, and we then add the 10 million in here, and we wind up at a different equilibrium point. So now uh, the supply curve after the quota and the demand curve intersect each other at the $7 mark. So again, the price of the t-shirts rises $2 to $7. The amount of t-shirts declines from 60 million to 45 million t-shirts. Only 10 of those can be imported, so the other 35 have to be produced domestically. So the total quantity of t-shirts the consumers produce is less. The total number of shirts that are imported is less. The total number of shirts that are produced domestically is greater, and the price is higher. So consumers are harmed by import quotas. You can kind of see a theme here. They're now paying a higher price, $7, and they're able to consume less shirts. And so the combination of higher prices and a smaller quantity that they're able to consume makes them worse off. Who benefits from import quotas? Again, it's the domestic producers. The United States producers benefit from import quotas. They sell t-shirts at a higher price, $7 instead of 5, and they are able to sell a larger quantity of shirts, 35 million instead of 20 million. So they are definitely better off. Now, it's also true as a third party. So the importers of the shirts also benefit from import quotas because they don't have to sell at the world price. The world price is $5. They can buy the shirts at $5, and then they can sell them at $7. You see, this is a little bit different than a tariff where they're actually having to pay the extra $2 to the government. In this case, the government's not collecting anything; they're just limiting how many can come in. So the importers, the people who make the shirts overseas or buy them overseas and ship them in, also benefit because they get to charge a higher price than they would in the world market. Now, the import quotas, what's the net effect of all this? Well, again, it's the same. The net effect is a loss. More is lost by consumers than is gained by producers. And in each of these situations, with the tariffs or with the import quotas, part of the reason for this net loss is you're upsetting the balance of production. You're not taking advantage of all the opportunities you could be by specializing and arranging production around opportunity costs. So we're now producing some of these shirts here in the United States, even though the United States it's much more costly to do that. It's more cost. So we increase the amount of domestic production, and as a result of that, we're increasing the cost it takes to produce these t-shirts. There are other types of trade restrictions besides tariffs and quotas. There's thousands of health and safety restrictions and other types of restrictions that are designed to restrict international trade. Now, some of them are for good reasons. They're to keep citizens and consumers safe, and some of them are more they're designed really to just help domestic producers, maybe in the name of health or safety, but sometimes they just are really no different than a quota or a tariff. But sometimes, of course, they are. If you have produce or building materials that are either substandard or not properly suited to the market they're being sold in, well, that's a good reason then to restrict having them imported. Now, there's another type of interference with trade or interference with free trade, and this is a little different. This is an export subsidy. Now, this is a situation where the government pays a domestic producer for an imported good. So, in this case, they're subsidizing the production. This will enable the producer to produce more and, in effect, get a higher price. In this case, the money comes directly from the government, which means it comes from the taxpayers. Now, the result of this is we're going to kind of overproduce the product that's being subsidized in a domestic commodity and underproduce it in the rest of the world. And so again, we're going to be invoking higher costs and higher cost structures in an effort to help domestic producers or the exports of a good. And this has been done in the United States. Subsidizes a lot of the corn that's produced in some parts of the world where they make computer chips. A lot of the operations around that are subsidized, and uh, different places around the world will subsidize different things in the hope that they're able to expand or build on the amount of exported goods. So these are export subsidies, and they have the same effect. You basically wind up with higher prices, and in this case, you'll wind up with more being produced because some of the costs are being borne by the government and not by the actual consumers. Now, when governments interfere with free international trade, we call that protectionism. So, what are some of the arguments or ideas on why governments do that? Well, there's a few. One of them is to try to help a new industry get off the ground. Um, maybe they don't have comparative advantage now, but after they've gained some experience, they would then be in a position where they had some comparative advantage, and if we could just get them started, then they'd be on their way. We protect them from the intense international competition until it can stand alone and compete. And this is a common idea on why we might subsidize or protect a new or infant industry. There aren't there aren't that many examples of where this works. Ultimately, the economics of the trade depend upon the underlying economics and strengths and weaknesses, and the relative costs within the various countries or places where manufacture is going on. And so um, this is oftentimes done more for political reasons than for purely economic reasons. Well, another reason we might protect a domestic industry is to save domestic jobs. Protectionism helps protect domestic jobs from foreign competition. Now, interestingly enough, one of the this type of protectionism is particularly costly. Um, it this when you're the amount of costs and the number of jobs saved is usually very high. The amount of cost it takes to try to save um, uh, jobs through some form of protectionism. And it's also true, we have to remember that free trade and imports create other jobs. And by shutting off free trade, we're not allowing these jobs to be kind of created and to happen. And then, of course, if we allow free trade, then other countries will build up some wealth and income. That creates demand for our imports, and the whole cycle goes through. So again, we're focusing very much on one particular party, the domestic workers. We're using the power of government and trade restrictions to advantage them. And there are other there you know there are there's a number of other costs, and sometimes these costs are quite high that taxpayers and consumers have to bear. The third idea is it allows us to compete with cheap foreign labor. Um, the this is a kind of a common theme behind some protectionism. The problem here is that wages and the the point of international trade is to specialize around comparative advantage and then to trade from there. And if we do that, both countries will be better off. You know, sometimes one country may have a cheap labor that may be their comparative advantage. Another country may have more capital invested, be more productive, and so we really don't want to interfere with that. Uh, with those specializations around comparative advantage, because then we're going to miss or lose some opportunities for for trade and to benefit from trade. And then, of course, the last is the idea that maybe if we uh, um, stop countries from trading, we can stop affluent countries from exporting development countries. But we know the model of specialization around comparative advantage in trade works even when one country is wealthier than another country. Maybe if they're more productive in every aspect, both countries will still be better off by specializing and trading. Both countries have more after trade than before trade. So, um, there's the sentiment behind blocking international trade or placing restrictions on international trade is sometimes, well intentioned, but I think the underlying economics of the unintended consequences wind up being problematic. But wind up we know that trade is mutually beneficial. Specializing around comparative advantage enables countries to trade in a way where they're both better off. And when we interfere with that, we interfere with the underlying economics of that, then we create unintended consequences, which are negative. So protectionism. Why do we often have it? Well, protectionism really comes out of it's more about politics than economics. Protectionism is a form of rent seeking. Rent seeking is when a special interest or party uses lobbying and political activity in general on behalf of producers that seek to capture some sort of gains from trade. So they want to profit. If we can create some sort of restrictions, we know we can charge higher prices and sell more products, and therefore we can benefit. And that's what the idea behind protectionism is. Now, um, if we look at the situation, we know that free trade benefits consumers. they're able to have more products at lower costs, but the benefit to individual consumers is kind of small. Now, producers have the opposite situation. So they're harmed when they have to compete with external companies in other nations that are they're going to import goods and sell them in the United States because domestic producers are able to sell fewer items at lower prices. But the producers are smaller in number, so they have an ability and incentive to do lobbying, to do rent seeking, to try to get a tariff or a quota or trade restriction, and to limit the amount of free trade and competition that they have. And we see the situation often with rent seeking and political activity that there are concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. So the gains from the gains from free trade for any one person are really too small for that person to spend a lot of time working on it, to spend a lot of money working on it, or a lot of political activity working on it. So we all benefit from free trade, but we all benefit a little bit. When you add it up, it's a lot, but individually, it's a little. Now, the producers, manufacturers, it's different. There's fewer in number. Their benefits are more concentrated. So it is in their interest to spend time and money and political capital in order to try to get these trade restrictions in place. And so we have this imbalance in the system. The 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 benefits to consumers are great, but they're widely dispersed, and they wind up being so that individual consumers are not really going to take a lot of actions to promote free trade. The benefits to producers are very concentrated, so it makes sense for them, economic sense for them, to go through the trouble of using political activity to get trade restrictions and to get import quotas, to get tariffs. And so we have this imbalance here. And so one of the reasons we ask is, if, why do we have protectionism? Why do we have tariffs? Why do we have quotas? And this is the reason, which is the way you get these things is through the political system, and the political system is better suited towards small numbers of people with concentrated benefits who can make the efforts to get these things done. Now, here's a case against protectionism. Bastiat said, and if you look historically, I think there's a lot of truth to this, that when goods don't cross borders, armies will. So we know that nations that trade freely with each other are much less likely to go to war, because free trade creates a mutual interest. Free trade creates an economic interdependence, which raises the cost of any sort of armed conflict for both countries. So, countries, when they're trading, countries, when they are interdependent in this way, are much less likely to be engaged in hostile conflict or to be engaged in war, because they're not they're giving up a lot. They're by doing so. So the perhaps another reason to be in support of free trade is that free trade um, is more conducive to countries peacefully getting along. Nations that trade freely are less likely to go to war. It creates an interdependence where they both not only are better off from trading, but the costs of disrupting trade become quite great. And so this is our lecture on free trade and international trade.